So I'm playing Scythe the other day when I spot this bizarre line in the rulebook. Banned combinations. The player with the industrial player mat may not choose the Rusviet faction. Wait a minute, something is so broken it needs to be officially banned? It's like finding a do not microwave label on your cereal box. Someone somewhere really messed up. And naturally, I went down the rabbit hole. And while competitive players still debate the exact numbers, the evidence is overwhelming. This combo is so powerful it needed an official ban. It's a point salad slaughter that makes everyone else at the table feel like they're playing a different game entirely. This brings me to a fact of life. Game balance is a mess. It's the thing that can instantly ruin whatever brilliant idea you might have underneath and send your game straight to the Forgotten Isles of the Shadow Realm. So why is balance so hard? Because so often we end up only looking at the surface level, the math, the numbers. That's the visible part of this balance iceberg. It's definitely important, but it's not the whole story. The real force that holds a game together is hidden beneath the surface. It's a contract, an unspoken promise between the designer and the player. It's the mess. Now, when I say game balance, what comes to mind? Seriously, let me know in the comments because even the experts can't agree. And I took a dip into Google Scholar, and there's this 2020 study titled "What is Game Balancing? An Examination of Concepts," that looked at 14 different definitions of the process of game balancing, and its resultant state from different designers and thinkers. Their ultimate conclusion? Further research is required. Thanks. But even without a perfect definition, the study found that most experts circle around four main aspects: the characteristics of a well-balanced game, the role of difficulty, the concept of symmetry, and the balancing process itself. By understanding these, we can build a framework that actually helps us think about balance. And when you look at those four ideas, a pattern emerges. They aren't just talking about games in a vacuum. They're all about the relationship between the game systems and the player's experience. And that relationship is key because game balance isn't a spreadsheet. It's really a contract between the designer and the player. The reality is that game designers have talked about these ideas for years and years, and have been using terms like negative feedback loops and fairness to make sense of it all. I see it as a contract between the designers and the players. The designer's job is to manage what I call absolute balance, making sure that the raw numbers and the mechanics don't create unwinnable situations from the start. The player's job is to provide relational balance. We police the leader, we experiment with counters, and punish obviously powerful strategies through our interactions. A game is truly balanced when both sides hold up their end of the deal. And let me show you what I mean. At its core, a balanced game is about meaningful decisions. You look at your options, weigh the pros and cons, and you actually have choices that matter. Your skill should be the main thing determining whether you win or lose, not the game's mechanics inherently. The Rusviet industrial combo breaks this deal completely. When you have an option that's overwhelmingly powerful, it creates what designers called a dominant strategy. But we gamers have a better word for it. It's degenerative, because it degenerates the game into a mindless script. Once a strategy is manifested into the psyche of gamers, there are no more meaningful decisions. The objectively best choice is to take the broken combo. All of those other clever mechanics and beautiful components, they become a part of your miniature collection. And once you get into that dominant strategy, you're not really playing Scythe anymore. You're following an IKEA manual to victory. All that's missing is the tiny Allen key and the quiet weeping. For everyone else at the table, the challenge evaporates. It's not a fun puzzle to solve, it's just watching someone else execute a predetermined script while you play a completely different, much worse game. It's full disengagement from the game and into a practiced routine. Now, it is worth a small note here. That study I mentioned from 2020, it actually has a problem with the term meaningful decision, pointing out that it's often circularly defined as simply a decision that isn't meaningless. And I actually think that's a fair critique, but for us, the players, meaningful isn't really an academic term that needs to be computed and perfectly defined, in my opinion. It's more of a feeling, and it's that feeling that your brain is really the most important component in the box. With that Rust-Viet industrial combo, it takes your brain out of the equation and you're just following a memorized pattern. But here's the nuance. Perfect mathematical balance where every option is precisely equal is deathly boring. Think about it. If every strategy is just as good as every other, what's there to discover? The game becomes a stagnant mass from the very start. It's just a chore to play. And the game has no spark at that point. There's never an aha moment when you find a clever synergy, and any thrill or counter just doesn't exist anymore. In fact, that 2020 study highlights a solution from designers like James Portnow, and it's a solution with a name that sounds like a little bit of a contradiction, but he calls it perfect imbalance. The idea isn't that the game should be broken, it's that games should employ these teeny tiny differences in power. The goal is to introduce intentional gaps that encourage players to explore and experiment and to constantly hunt for a new edge. This creates a living, breathing metagame where popular strategies rise, counters are developed, and the best way to play is always shifting. It redefines balance away from a flat mathematical stalemate and towards a more dynamic puzzle of discovery. And this magic mix is what keeps games feeling fresh for years. This can be a deliberate or completely 100% unintentional part of the designer's side of the contract. They're not just managing the absolute balance to prevent these broken combos. There's an art form to shaping the game to give players a dynamic, evolving puzzle to solve. And it truly can be unintentional. But just like other forms of art, the public interpretation and use breathes eternal life into these games. But if a slight imbalance is desirable, what's the safety net? What stops a powerful strategy from shattering the game? The answer is us, the players. And this brings us to the other half of our contract, relational balance. And the main tool players use to enforce their side of the contract is meaningful player interaction. Think of games with very little interaction, those multiplayer solitaire games. In these games, everyone is essentially building their own engine in their own little sandbox. The only time you really interact with one another is when you tally up points at the end. These games are notoriously difficult to balance. Why? Because the designer has to get the absolute balance, the raw math and the mechanics, almost perfect. There is no safety net. If one engine is even slightly more efficient than the others, there's nothing the other players can do to slow it down, disrupt it, or throw a wrench into that machine. The players have no tools to engage with their side of the contract. This creates a fundamental principle of game balance. The more meaningful interaction a game has, the more resilient it is to imbalance. The players themselves become a core balancing mechanism, able to adapt and react to threats in a way that no spreadsheet ever could. In a no-interaction game, the contract is 100% tilted to the absolute balance, and players are fully disengaged from one another without a way to moderate one another. But to see this contract in its most powerful form, let's turn to a game that is famous for its high level of interaction. Let me show you how this contract can actually work. If you've seen my other content, you know I'm slightly obsessed with Root, the asymmetric game of cute woodland warfare. Root has 10 officially released factions, and there's definitely a perceived power hierarchy. The vagabond and moles are near the top, the lizards and crows are near the bottom, and between each faction there's a small gap of power. When you add up all of these gaps, that's what you get, the absolute balance, the maximum power variance in the system. In Root, it's actually pretty significant. On paper, some matchups should be incredibly one-sided, but Root works, for the most part. And why is that? Because of the second layer, the relational balance. And I want you to picture this with me. It's a 4-player game with cats, moles, lizards, and crows. The moles are the strongest faction at this table. They can absolutely explode on the scoreboard if left alone. In most tableau builders or low interaction games, the mole player would just optimize their engine and dig their way to victory. But Root isn't a tableau builder, it's a war simulator. A savvy table knows what's coming. The cats can see the writing on the wall and move to dismantle the mole's engine before they can sway ministers. The crows know exactly when to extort to stop a critical sway. And even the lizards become a scalpel, surgically converting a key warrior or sanctifying the one building the moles can't afford to lose. The players, united by a fear of mole victory, naturally form temporary alliances to police the leader. This is a negative feedback loop. The faction's strengths form a mechanism and motivation that naturally limits their power level. In essence, the mole strengths become a liability. They have to play cautiously and manage their threat level, and navigate all those social dynamics on a table. Their power isn't just a calculation from a spreadsheet. It becomes relative to how other players react to it. This is relational balance in action, and Root can survive significant absolute balance because its relational balance, driven by these powerful negative feedback loops and social dynamics, is so incredibly strong. The players hold up their end of the contract to keep the game feeling fair, even with the huge asymmetry and power gaps. Of course, if you have a new player at a table, or players who don't recognize the threat, this whole aspect of relational balance is modified into another form, or collapses in totality. Player skill and social dynamics are the ink that the contract is written in. But to see what happens when this contract completely collapses, when the designer fails to provide the tools and the players are left helpless, our journey into game balance has us leave the fictional fields of Europa and the forest of Root, and will take us to someplace very real and very unexpected. Halifax, Canada. The Halifax Hammer. It sounds like a craft beer, but it's actually the most infamous game-breaking strategy in board game history. A Few Acres of Snow is a brilliant 2-player deck-building war game from the legendary Martin Wallace. It's also a brilliant game with a fatal flaw. Here's what makes the Halifax Hammer so devastating. It isn't necessarily a rigid step-by-step script like the Rusviet Industrial Combo. Instead, it's more like a strategic doctrine, a single-minded British grind set of applying relentless, overwhelming military pressure while ignoring almost everything else the game has to offer. It begins with a short, brutally efficient setup phase. Settle in Halifax, draft in a few key cards, and thin in your deck. But after that, the doctrine just takes over. The British player's turn become a simple, terrifying loop. Use merchants for money, buy more military, and siege. That's it. Every action is dedicated to increasing the pressure. Now, the exact details might shift based on what the French player desperately tries to do, but the outcome is always the same. The British player settles Halifax on the first turn, initiates a siege, usually on a critical location like Louisbourg. This immediately puts the French on the back foot, crippling their economy and military options. Then the hammer is crafted through those merchant actions and that deck building, eventually gain more and more military might. At this point, the British war machine is simply too efficient. It doesn't matter if the French try to build their own army, raid with Native Americans, or fortify their towns. The Halifax Hammer doctrine is designed to outpace and crush any response that culminates in the final game-ending siege on Quebec. And it's a blunt instrument. The power lies in its refusal to engage with the rest of the game's systems, turning a nuanced strategic puzzle into a raw, unstoppable military attrition that the French are simply not equipped to win. This is the ultimate example of what happens when both layers of balance fail. First, the absolute balance is enormous. The Halifax Hammer doesn't make the British player a little stronger. It makes them operate on a completely different level. The French are trying to solve this little jigsaw puzzle, while the British are just taking a hammer to the box. But the real killer is the complete failure of relational balance. Remember how root players can see the leader and team up to stop them? That really can't happen here. The entire deck thinning process happens in the British player's own space. The French player can't attack their discard pile, can't force them to keep bad cards, and can't disrupt the engine while it's being built. It's a critical phase of solitaire, and it leaves the French player with zero interactive tools to stop the engine. Plus, this is a 1 versus 1 game. There's no alliance of weaker factions to police the runaway leader. You're forced to sit there and watch as your opponent assembles the hammer, knowing exactly what's coming, but you have zero tools to stop it. By the time the military attacks begin, the game is practically already over. The British engine is too perfect. The Halifax Hammer is what happens when a game relies on players to self-balance, but doesn't give them the tools to do it. Its massive absolute balance with almost zero relational balance doesn't provide mechanisms to make a balanced game. Now, you might say, well, just adjust a few of the numbers or ban some combo, and to his credit, Martin Wallace actually released a second edition and rule amendments specifically meant to address this problem. And the game, surprisingly enough, was still broken. Of course, some diehard fans developed counter strategies, but these often required the French to play very specific, non-intuitive, and frankly less fun games just to survive. Or you could simply remove entire elements from the game, like people would remove the governor cards to prevent efficient thinning of decks. At this point, when the counter is to abandon aspects of the game or to house rule it into a third edition, it's not really a solution for the public at large. It's proof that the contract was broken. And in the end, even the designer admitted that 2 players of this type might be inherently broken, and eventually he conceded that the game was fundamentally flawed.
They're going to help, but they're not going to fix it, because I think the thing is, when you're talking about 2-player war games, effectively, you probably find nearly all 2-player war games are broken at some level. It's just some people have never got to the point of working. Chess is, theoretically, chess is broken. There has to be an optimum strategy. It's just nobody's found it yet.
And that brings us full circle back to Scythe. The reason why that official fix for the Rus-Viet industrial combo is a ban, and not some unintuitive fan-discovered counter-strategy, is because the designers realized the very same thing. Forcing players into very specific and less fun playstyles just to survive isn't a meaningful choice. It's an admission that the designer's side of the contract was flawed, and they had to step in to make it right. And that brings us back. It's meaningful choices that create that balanced game, and both the Rus-Viet industrial combo and the Halifax Hammer remove you from those choices. So after banned combos, table policing, and the infamous hammers, where does that leave us? It leaves us with the messy truth. Game balance isn't a perfect state you achieve once and forget about. It's not about making every piece mathematically equal or ensuring every strategy is equally viable. Game balance is an ongoing contract between designers and players. It's the designer's job and part to manage that absolute balance. Make sure the numbers don't create fundamentally unwinnable situations. Give the players the tools they need to balance one another. On the player's part, it's to recognize the relational balance, police the leader and experiment with counters. Punish those obviously powerful moves through interaction and social dynamics. Root works because the contract is honored, The designer provides a complex toolkit and expects those expert players to wield it. A few acres of snow and that Halifax Hammer, it breaks the game completely because the contract is void. The system is flawed, and the designer has no way to give those players agency to fight against such a strategy. Cites bans are the contract being amended. The designer admits a flaw and steps in with an official patch to make it right. But even this contract is constantly being stress tested by forces that often lie just outside of it. Think about player skill disparities, where a veteran can dominate novices regardless of faction choice. And yes, I have more to say in a future video, like balance in single player games, or the wild card of randomness itself. A lucky card or a string of perfect dice rolls can shatter the most carefully laid plans in so many games. But you can actually check that one out right away. That said, there's other aspects. Even player count can fundamentally change how players are able to interact and police one another, altering those terms of the contract from one game to the next. Not to mention those 1 versus 1 games. I think Martin Wallace might have a point that I would like to talk about in a future video as well. So no, game balance isn't just a simple number or a perfect equation. As the experts in that study showed, it's dynamic, messy, and deeply human of a process. It's the push and pull between cold math of the system itself and the warm chaos of player interaction. And that mess is what makes it so fascinating. They're games where both the designers and the players are working together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. And that's game balance, that's the contract. And when it works, it's a beautiful mess. So what's a game that you love that you think has brilliant balanced contracts? Or what's a game that's completely broken those contracts? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. And bye.